You're listening to Joko Yo. This episode is about the men that nobody put a statue up for. Johnston County has a courthouse lawn with monuments on it. It has a battlefield at Bentonville where 1,500 county men fought in the last major engagement of the Civil War. It has a heritage center with a searchable database of every man who served in a Confederate army from this county, their names, their regiments, their fates. What it doesn't have a monument to is the men who didn't go. And some of those men were braver than anyone who did. Let me tell you about a war inside the war. Most people know the Civil War was a story between slavery and not slavery, blue and gray, so to speak, which two sides mostly defined fighting it out until one surrendered. That's the version of the battlefield markers, and that's the version in the textbooks. They like to portray it as a North and South kind of thing. Here's what your textbooks leave out. I know because I read them. North Carolina led the Confederacy with nearly 25,000 deserters, feeding a political war in Unionist counties. Nearly a quarter of every Confederate soldier from this state eventually left. Some were caught and brought back at gunpoint, some hid in swamps. Some made it north, some came home to their farms and their families and stayed there, daring the home guard to come find them. Some changed their names and hid. I think there was a movie about that once called Richard Gere, or with Richard Gere and Jodie Foster in it. And some of them weren't deserters at all. Some of them had never wanted to go in the first place. During the Civil War, roughly 1,500 men from Johnston County either volunteered or were conscripted to serve in the Confederate Army. Volunteered or were conscripted. That word conscripted is doing a lot of work in that sentence. In April 1862, the Confederate Congress passed the first National Conscription Act in American history. Every able-bodied white man between 17 and 35 was required by law to serve. First time. By 1864, that range had widened from 17 to 50. You did not volunteer, you were taken. And the men who were taken were not all true believers. Some held Unionist views and disagreed with the war. Some were simply apathetic and felt compelled to stay home to care for their families, who they actually did care about. Others resented the planter class and felt they were fighting a war so that rich men could keep their enslaved property. They weren't wrong. Rich man's war and a poor man's fight, I always heard. That phrase circulated through the Confederacy like a fever. In Johnston County, where most white men were small farmers with no enslaved people and no particular stake in preserving a plantation economy, it landed pretty hard. Across North Carolina, a resistance was forming. It called itself the Heroes of America. Its members called themselves the Red Strings after the piece of red string they wore on their lapels or hung in their windows, a signal, if you knew what to look for, that this house was a safe house, that this person was a friend. This is all true. The inspiration came from the biblical book of Joshua, in which Joshua told Rahab to tie a red string to her window to distinguish herself as an ally. A 3,000-year-old story of sanctuary repurposed for a tobacco farming county in 1863. The members engaged in encouraging disloyalty on the home front and desertion in the Confederate Army, providing military intelligence to federal authorities, maintaining an underground railroad to transport members to Union lines. If you're caught, you're going to be hanged. This was not a mild form of dissent. This was treason by Confederate law, punishable by death. The appeal of the heroes was greatest among small farmers and working-class whites who felt pushed into a war by the plantation class, men who didn't own people, men whose wives were trying to keep a farm running alone while the home guard came around looking for their husbands, men who had done the math and decided that whatever this war was about, it wasn't about them, and that the men calling them cowards for saying so were the same men who had exempted themselves from conscription by owning more than 20 enslaved people. That's rich. There was a provision in the Confederate conscription law called the, I quote, the 20 Negro Law that exempted one white man per plantation that held 20 or more enslaved people. The message it sent to poor white farmers was clear enough. Again, rich man's war, poor man's fight. The heroes spread east from the Piedmont Quaker Belt. From their founding base west of Raleigh, they moved toward Kinston, Goldsboro, and the coast. Johnston County sits squarely between those places. The Red Strings certainly passed through here. Some almost certainly lived here. We don't know their names, that's the point. The organization operated in secret precisely because being named meant dying. Most heroes only knew one or two of their members. The red string in the window said everything that needed saying without anyone having to say it out loud. Somewhere in Johnston County, on farms along the Neuse, in houses in Smithfield, or what's going to later be Benson, or somewhere between, there were men and women who made a decision. Maybe they hid a deserter in the barn. Maybe they sent a conscript in the wrong direction when the home guard came asking. Maybe they kept their mouth shut when a neighbor went missing and they knew exactly where he was. They were called cowards. The Confederate press called them cowards. The Home Guard called them cowards. The neighbors who sent their sons off to die at Gettysburg and Chickamauga called them cowards. And here's what I want you to think about. The Kenny Rogers song, Coward of the County, is about a man who grows up being called a coward because he walked away from a fight his daddy told him to walk away from. The whole town uses that word for him. It defines him. And then one day something happens that the town didn't expect and nobody calls him a coward again. The Johnston County version of this story doesn't have that ending. The men who hid in swamps and barns, the women who fed them and kept their secrets, the families who sheltered deserters and draft resistors and said nothing when the home guard came knocking, they didn't get a monument. They didn't get a moment where the town changed its mind. They got Reconstruction, then redemption, then 60 years of this lost cause mythology that hardened the word coward into something permanent. Many of the relatively devoted Confederates who deserted and served more than 18 months, they had seen enough and felt a greater loyalty to their families and to a cause they had begun to see as hopeless. They weren't philosophical pacifists. They were just men who had been away from their farms for a year and a half and whose families were starving and who decided that enough was enough. History called them cowards too. After the war, the heroes of America didn't disappear. During Reconstruction, the HOA protected its members, including numerous Union Army veterans from North Carolina, from hostile ex-Confederates. For a brief window, the men who had resisted the Confederacy from within held political power in this state. They aligned with the Republican Party. They supported black civil rights. They tried to build something different. And then the Redeemers came, and the Klan came, and the disenfranchisement came, and the monuments went up on the courthouse lawn to make heroes of people that had turned against their country. And the story that got told for the next 100 years is the story of the men who fought, the men who didn't fight, the men who hid, resisted, who strung red strings in their windows, were ridden out of it. Cowards don't get to tell the story, the winners do. That's kind of funny because the Confederates also lost. But here's the thing that is true. North Carolina was the stage for the starkest internal opposition of all the southern states during the war. There are so many reasons for that, and home to the largest number of Confederate deserters, according to historians. These men were from somewhere. They came from counties. They came from farms. They came from families who knew them and sheltered them and called them something other than coward when nobody else was listening. Some of them came to Johnston County. Some people changed their names, had to. Nobody put their names in a database. Nobody put their names on a courthouse lawn, but they were here. The heroes of America operated primarily to the west of Johnston County in the Piedmont Quaker Belt, centered around Randolph and Guilford counties. Now, whether a formal chapter existed in Johnston County, it's not documented. What is documented is that desertion ran at nearly 25% across all North Carolina Confederate troops. But y'all, 1/4 of all the Confederate soldiers deserted. That the organization spread eastward toward Goldsboro and the coast, and that Johnston County sat squarely in that path. When you have 25% desertion rate, this ain't a north-south thing. It's not a north-south thing. It's a right-wrong thing. And the people at the time knew it. People that like to praise that they were somehow doing something noble, the people that were then there at the time, 25% desertion rate means that people knew it was wrong at the time. People that were there, not somebody's grandson. And people who were actually there at the time in this world, in this situation, knew it. If they didn't know it, you wouldn't have had a 25% desertion rate. If you want to look for them, the place to start is the Johnston County Heritage Center's Slave Trial and Civil War records, and the Southern Claims Commission files at the National Archives, where Unionists filed claims after the war for property taken by Confederate forces. Some of those names might be in Johnston County names. I don't know. I would like to know. And y'all, sometimes we talk about people and parts that nobody put a monument up or a statue up for. This is Joko Yo, and y'all have a great day.